the dating itself is tricky. I mean, this is one of the things that
I think John's Gospel is first century for sure, 70 AD. I'll place it there,
so
but that's neither here nor there.
What makes you so sure about that?
I could pull up sources we've covered it on the channel in terms of people considering it dating earlier and earlier based on what is it the one of those manuscripts that was found to be
P52?
early first century. Was it P90? Was it P95? I don't know.
P90X.
P90X.
I think you're thinking you might be.
I'm thinking about the workout.
P52 is
P52.
The P52 is the.
He hit me with the P90X workout back in the day. That was great.
Tony Horton.
Tony Horton, baby. P90. What is it? P55.
I think you're thinking of P52.
52. Yeah.
And
well, if it's early first century, if it's early second century, that means that the Gospel of John was already moving, and if it was moving, then it was likely written in the late first century.
Yeah, so we've come full circle. This is another thing that Wes Huff says in his podcast with Joe Rogan. Unfortunately, I do just think that is incorrect. P52 could be dated early, but like the scholarly consensus on this is also out, and we have to at least allow for a early 3rd century dating of the fragment of P52. And the John Rylands Library in Manchester.
Century. Wow. Okay.
Yes. And the John Rylands Library in Manchester, which holds P52, they say that the evidence is pointing towards a date closer to 200 AD. I think that's probably the safest bet. It's like around the 200 AD mark, right? Mm-hmm. Some people want to date it earlier. That's fine. Brent Nongbury is the person to talk to on this, and he wrote a paper in the Harvard Review of a theological review. I mentioned this in my video, called "The Use and Abuse of P52." Because people use it with this apologetical motive of trying to establish the early writing of John. There are so many problems with this. The first is that you just can't confidently date it that early. It can't be done.
Sure.
So
of course, that's the argument. Others have dated it that early.
Yeah, Gavin's response to me said that, like, when I pointed out that, like, the dating of P52 is much broader than comfortably early 2nd century, let's say, which is I think what you'd need for this argument. He said, well, okay, well that allows for a later dating of John, but it doesn't mean that John's late. Well, of course it doesn't. I'm not going to say that John is late, but the idea that you can establish that John is in the 1st century because P52 was written early in the 2nd century and it had to travel around for enough time, like, if you allow for later dating of P52, then you cannot comfortably put John into the 1st century on those grounds. There might be other grounds, but P52 is not a very good one of them. That's why the paper is called "The Use and Abuse of P52." Most interesting about this to me is that, like, even if you take an early-ish dating for P52, like originally when it was found, it was thought to date between 100 and 150 AD. Like I say, the consensus is pushing that more towards like 200 now. Even if you take like 125 or something, like the distance between Ephesus, which is where John traditionally is said to have written his gospel, and the site where P52 like comes from is like not that far. Like, I mean, it's far in that it would like take you a few weeks as an ancient traveler to get there, but we're talking about, like, at an early dating of P52, giving it 25 years to get there. And that's if it's early. Like, it could be that it had over a century to travel to Egypt to then to then be discovered there. So, like, all of this, as I say, is speculative, and the consensus is, I like Wes said, it's comfortably 2nd century in the podcast. That was the quote. Like, again, that's not something that I'm going to like pick him up on its own sake. Like, okay, technically Brent Nongbury thinks that we should include like early 3rd century, dates as a possibility. But like, whatever, if he'd have just said, oh, P52 is really interesting, comfortably 2nd century, cool. But it's the fact that he then says that this can give us a 1st century dating of John, because it has to have been, he says, I think the phrases that he uses is, he says that P52 is comfortably early 2nd century. He says maybe even early 2nd century or something like this. And then he says, which means that at a minimum, we can comfortably push John back into the 1st century. Yeah, that is assuming this early date of P52. But that assumption is like essentially an ungrounded one. At least, Wes might have his reasons, but he didn't present them there, and it's not in line with, I think, the academic consensus. So this dating of P52 business should not be used in the way that it is to give a 1st century dating of John.
Sure. Yeah, I would say I would need to see the academic consensus. I've seen both
Of course, yeah,
arguments
I mean,
across the spectrum: early dating, young dating. I mean, I think one can argue First Corinthians very early written, and they say that First Corinthians 15 creed goes back to within years of Jesus's resurrection. So I've heard that argument made. There's all types of arguments that can be made for this. Yeah. So
something about what about the resurrection?
First Corinthians 15. He shows up to the 500. He shows up to these people. He shows up to these people.
Yeah,
That's written. I want to say, what is it? 50.
Oh, right. Yeah. So
50.
this is really interesting.
And then they're
idea
saying
that
creed that he's reciting to them goes back to the 30s.
yes,
I've heard that.
Now, how does that creed end?
What do you mean? The creed ends with him with the resurrection claim,
how does that
the
end?
bodily resurrection, and some are still alive.
Well,
Right?
he says, yeah, but where does he go? So he says, then they appear to Cephas, then they appear to the 12,
then the 500.
and last of all,
yeah,
then 500,
right?
then last of all,
and then to me.
Then last of all, he appeared to me, right? So
yeah.
It's well known that at some point, if this is some early creed that he's reciting, at some point he breaks off from the creed,
Sure,
and is just talking from his own experience, because the creed would not include last of all it appears to me.
Sure,
maybe
sure.
That's where he breaks off, but it's not entirely clear, right?
Okay.
So that is an interesting thing to talk about too, like whether that creed is an early sort of part of First Corinthians. But like, as I say, all of this is fascinating, and it kind of gets lost in I think a lot of the debate. But this dating of John to the first century is
you don't like
dubious.
it.
That's not to say wrong. It's just to say that, like, it's not. I don't think we can do it with so much confidence. Like, as I've pointed out, I think in the video I pointed this out. Like, there are scholars who are thinking that John is later. There are scholars who are thinking that Luke might be later than John now, because they think it might show some knowledge of the writings of Josephus and this kind of stuff. Like, there's all kinds of stuff like this going on all the time.
Sure.
We just don't know. The only thing that we can really be confident about is like the literary dependence between Matthew and Luke and Mark. And the dating of Matthew and Luke are highly dependent on the dating of Mark in many ways, except in their lower bound, because we use the destruction of the temple. But then if you're a Christian, yeah, maybe Jesus just did accurately predict it. So there's so much going on here.
Well, yeah, because if you're presupposing that he can't, if you're presupposing he can, then you got to date it later. But if you're presupposing he can, then you have no problem with it being early.
Yeah, exactly. So if Wes Huff says, look, P52, I think it's probably mid second century, maybe even early second century. And if that's the case, then given how much time it would take to move around, like, I think we've got a pretty good indication that John might be first century. Fine. Mm-hmm. But if you say that P52 is comfortably second century, and therefore at a minimum and comfortably we can push John into the first century, I just think that this is, again, misleading as to what the scholarly consensus actually is. And what it's going to make people believe is that, the Isaiah scroll is word for word identical, and John is super early, and we can know it with confidence.
We came full
circle. The Gospel of Peter, by the way, he does the opposite thing. He does the opposite thing with the Gospel of Peter, the apocryphal Gospel of Peter, which in the podcast he dates between the 2nd and the 4th century, which is like a radically late dating for Peter. Like who thinks it was who thinks it was written in the 4th century? Like can you name a scholar who believes that? I'm sure somebody can, but like it's not very popularly believed. And so it's like there is something a bit unfortunate about the way that when it comes to John or the Isaiah scroll, we're going with the most charitable like understanding of their dating and whatnot. But when it comes to something like the Gospel of Peter, it's the least charitable possible, like dating that would be scholarly, taken scholarly seriously. I think that's kind of interesting. The stuff about Paul as well, I don't think that's been sufficiently addressed in many ways, like by some of the responses about the whole 500 thing. I think that's really interesting, about how we don't know who these people are. It's the only time it shows up, and there is an indication that Paul might have been talking about a vision in the sky. There's like so much interesting stuff here. And
there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
The most unfortunate thing about it is that that's getting lost.
Yeah, I guess what I come back to is there's all sorts of interesting stuff, and that I don't. Yeah, when you say comfortably, I don't like the word comfortably. I don't like this word. Like, that's where I'm like, okay, Alex. Like, it does seem that we're going back to the full circle moment of the conversation, and even Wes is like, the point of that wasn't an apologetic for it. I think he had a different idea with that, which again he'll address with you whenever he gets around to it.
This is really important though, because of course, like with John's Gospel, let's say, like if we're disputing whether John was written in 90 AD or 120 AD, that's like the difference between whether the eyewitnesses are still alive or not. That's a big deal. Like the difference between 150 and 170 might not be a big deal, but like when you're talking around that kind of time, it makes all the difference as to whether this could have been written by John, the son of Zebedee, which I don't think scholars tend to believe, but that's how tradition has identified it. And certainly whether it's written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses is heavily dependent on these few decades of dating around the turn of the second century.
Yeah.
And if you're going to rely on P52 to do that, like you're
Yeah.
on very fragmented grounding, if you like.
Fair enough. And I'm pretty. West was not using P52 as an apologetic argument. He was using it as a story. In terms
as an
of
apologetic for the early dating of John, though, right? Like he was using it as an apologetic for the early dating.
I don't even think I think he was primarily speaking to it being a facsimile, right? In terms of the way he was presenting it to Joe Rogan.
Well, he had this facsimile that he gave to Joe, which was kind of a cute moment. Like that's a cool thing to do. But
I'm sure he can make one for you, Alex.
He brought. I would love one, especially made by West Huff. If he could sign it, that'd be cool. There's
I'll
one
pay for it.
In Hebrew.
like he brings it up later. Yeah, let's do it in Coptic or something.
Of the Isaiah scroll, of the missing verses from Isaiah that you're upset about.
Here they are. I sent them in the post because you said you were missing these. I think that he does bring it up later, though, like separate from the. Although I think he presents the facsimile and then maybe talks about it afterwards. But he's just talking about the dating of John, and he says that we can comfortably date John in the first century because of P52. I don't think that's true. That's something that I just don't think is true. And of course, you're probably not gonna want to talk about this in too much depth because this has sort of come up out of nowhere, and you'll want to check your sources, speak to scholars and stuff. But like I mean it when I say like that's also a big deal. It's not nitpicking. It's whether the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, which, as you remember, is one of the main apologetical tools generally that Wes used, like to Joe Rogan when explaining the Gospels.